Before we start, make sure to like, share, and subscribe because this story is going to shake you to the core. A simple decision, a moment of power, and an unexpected twist that changed everything. You won't believe what happens next. It was just another busy evening at Grayson's Steakhouse, an upscale restaurant owned by Ethan Grayson, a self-made millionaire with a reputation for being ruthless. His empire was built on strict rules, high expectations, and an unshakable belief that nothing in life comes for free. Employees feared him, customers admired him, and the business thrived under his leadership. Amelia Carter, a hard-working waitress, had spent the last 3 years dedicating herself to the restaurant. She was the kind of employee who never complained, always smiled, and worked double shifts without hesitation. She needed the job desperately, but today she was exhausted. Her stomach twisted in hunger, and the little cash she had left was for her mother's medication. As her shift came to an end, she nervously approached the kitchen, where a fresh tray of perfectly cooked filet mignon sat untouched. The restaurant had closed, and those meals were about to be thrown away. A practice Amelia had seen too many times before. It felt wasteful, cruel, knowing she had to walk home hungry while the restaurant tossed away food. Summoning courage, she stepped into the CEO's office. Ethan was going through some financial reports, his sharp blue eyes scanning numbers with laser focus. "Mr. Grayson," she started hesitantly, wringing her hands. "I was wondering if I could take home one of the leftover meals. Just one." Ethan barely looked up. "We don't give away free food, Amelia." His voice was flat, unemotional. "If you want a meal, you pay for it like everyone else." Her face heated with embarrassment. She had expected this, but some part of her had hoped for kindness. "But, sir, it's just going to be thrown out. I've worked a full shift, and I haven't had anything to eat." Ethan finally looked up, his expression cold. "Rules are rules. If I make an exception for you, I'd have to make one for everyone. This is a business, not a charity." Amelia swallowed hard, nodded, and turned away before he could see the tears forming in her eyes. Ethan watched as she walked out of his office, shoulders slumped, disappearing into the darkness of the night. To him, it was just another employee, another insignificant moment. But something about her defeated expression nagged at him. He had never given his employees much thought, just numbers on a payroll, cogs in a machine. Yet, tonight, something felt off. On impulse, he grabbed his car keys and decided to follow her home. He told himself it wasn't guilt. He just wanted to make sure she wasn't going to steal from the restaurant later out of desperation. But deep down, something pulled him toward knowing more. Ethan kept his distance as Amelia walked along the dark, empty streets, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. The neighborhood grew rougher, the streetlights flickering, casting eerie shadows. This wasn't a place he had ever been before. When she finally stopped, he realized she wasn't walking toward a home. She entered a rundown apartment building that looked more abandoned than livable. Ethan parked across the street, watching as she climbed the steps with heavy, exhausted movements. Then, to his absolute shock, she didn't even go inside. Instead, she knelt beside a bundle of blankets on the ground, and Ethan realized there was a frail woman underneath them. Amelia hadn't been walking home. She had been walking to her homeless mother. A sharp pang of something unfamiliar hit Ethan's chest. For the first time in years, he regretted a decision. And he knew this was only the beginning. Ethan sat frozen in his car, gripping the steering wheel as he watched Amelia kneel beside her mother. The dim streetlight flickered, casting weak shadows over the crumbling pavement. But there was no mistaking the reality before him. Amelia wasn't just struggling. She was barely surviving. Her mother coughed weakly, and Amelia immediately pulled a thin, ragged blanket tighter around the frail woman's shoulders. "Mom, I brought some water," Amelia whispered, pulling out a small bottle from her bag. "Drink slowly, okay?" The older woman, her face worn with exhaustion and illness, gave her a weak smile. "You always take care of me," she murmured. "Did you eat?" Amelia hesitated. Ethan already knew the answer. "I'm fine," she said softly. "I'll eat later, Liz." Ethan clenched his jaw. Just an hour ago, he had denied her a meal that was about to be thrown in the trash. He had turned her away, assuming she was just another employee looking for a handout. But this was something he hadn't expected. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. He had built his success on discipline, rules, and a strict belief that people needed to work for what they had. But Amelia was working harder than most. And yet, after an exhausting shift, she had no place to call home, no food to eat, and no warmth to return to. And the worst part? He had made it even harder for her. Ethan exhaled sharply, a rare wave of guilt settling in his chest. He had spent years making tough business decisions, cutting costs, increasing profits, and ensuring no one took advantage of his generosity, because generosity wasn't something he believed in. But this wasn't about business anymore. It was about a young woman who had given everything she had, and still had nothing. Amelia adjusted her mother's blanket and whispered something soothing, her exhaustion evident. Ethan could see the deep lines of stress on her face, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her like an unbearable force. He had never cared about his employees beyond their ability to perform. Their personal struggles weren't his concern. He paid them, they worked, that was the deal. So why was this different? Why was his stomach twisting with something he couldn't quite explain? A cold breeze swept through the street, making Amelia shiver, but she didn't move. She stayed close to her mother, protecting her with everything she had left. Ethan swallowed hard. He could leave. He could drive away and pretend he never saw this. It wasn't his problem. He didn't owe her anything. And yet, for the first time in his life, Ethan Grayson felt something unfamiliar. Regret. And a quiet, nagging voice telling him that maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong all along. Ethan sat in his car, staring at the heartbreaking scene before him. Amelia, exhausted from a full shift, sat beside her sick mother, keeping her warm with nothing but her presence and a thin blanket. He had seen desperation before, in business negotiations, in struggling competitors begging for partnerships, but this was different. This was real suffering, and for the first time, Ethan felt the crushing weight of a decision he had made. The meal he had denied her wouldn't have changed his bottom line. It wouldn't have affected his profits. But to Amelia, could have been everything. She adjusted her mother's blanket and whispered something Ethan couldn't hear. Her movements slow, careful. The older woman's face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the water bottle. She was sick, too sick to be living on the streets. Ethan clenched his jaw, a strange frustration building inside him. How had he never noticed Amelia's struggle before? She had worked for him for 3 years. Always punctual, always hardworking, never asking for anything. He had dismissed her request without a second thought, assuming she was just another employee looking for an easy favor. But now, as he watched her give the last of what she had to someone else, he realized just how wrong he had been. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. His assistant, probably reminding him of tomorrow's schedule. He ignored it. Ethan exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. He had built his life on logic, on discipline, on making calculated choices. He didn't act on emotion. He didn't believe in charity. But tonight, he couldn't just drive away. Stepping out of his luxury car, the cold air hit him instantly, but it was nothing compared to what Amelia and her mother had been enduring night after night. His expensive coat suddenly felt ridiculous, unnecessary, when he saw them huddled together for warmth. Amelia didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on her mother, adjusting the blanket, brushing strands of hair from her mother's face. Then finally she looked up and froze. Her eyes widened in shock, confusion flickering across her tired features. The last person she expected to see was her boss, the man who had just denied her a simple meal. Ethan? Her voice was barely above a whisper, laced with exhaustion and disbelief. For the first time in years, Ethan had no idea what to say. Amelia stared at Ethan as if she couldn't believe he was real. And honestly, she had every reason to be confused. Why was her boss standing here, in the middle of the night, in front of her reality, the one she had hidden so well? Her body tensed, instinctively shielding her mother from his gaze. She had spent years keeping her personal struggles separate from work, never asking for help, never wanting pity. And now, Ethan Grayson, the ruthless CEO who refused to give away food that was about to be trashed, stood before her, looking at her life like he had just stepped into another world. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice guarded. Ethan hesitated. For the first time in his life, he didn't have an answer. He stopped, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, something uncharacteristic for a man who always had everything under control. He had come here out of curiosity, maybe guilt, but standing here now, watching Amelia give everything she had to her sick mother while she had nothing for herself. It shook him. He took a step closer, but Amelia's shoulders squared, her exhaustion momentarily masked by defensiveness. "You followed me?" she accused, her voice tight. "Why?" Ethan exhaled. He hesitated. How could he explain this? That he had followed her home because something about the way she walked out of that restaurant had bothered him? That, for the first time in years, he regretted a decision? He looked past her, at the frail woman wrapped in thin blankets, coughing softly. This wasn't just struggle. This was survival. Amelia crossed her arms, her tired eyes filled with wariness. "Look, Mr. Grayson, if you're here to lecture me about company policies, don't bother. I get it. I broke the rule by asking for food. It won't happen again." Ethan flinched at her words. She thought he had come to scold her? "That's not," he exhaled. "That's not why I'm here." Silence stretched between them. Amelia didn't trust him. And why should she? He had never shown her any kindness. To her, he was just the boss who cared about profits, not people. Ethan shoved his hands in his coat pockets, glancing around the freezing street, the crumbling sidewalk, the graffiti-covered walls. This place was nothing like the world he knew. A world where warmth, comfort, and luxury were expected, not fought for. He cleared his throat, his voice lower now. "How long have you and your mother been out here?" Amelia's jaw tightened. "Why does it matter?" Ethan didn't look away. "Because I should have known." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Grayson. I work, I get paid, that's the deal. I didn't expect anything more." And yet she had asked for one thing, just one meal, and he had denied her. Ethan's throat felt tight. He had prided himself on being a strong leader, a businessman who made tough calls without hesitation. But standing here, in the cold, in front of the consequences of his own decision, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Shame. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet. "Take this." He extended a stack of bills toward her. Amelia's eyes darkened. "I don't need your pity." "It's not pity," Ethan said firmly. "It's the least I can do." She didn't move. "Take it, Amelia," he urged. "For your mother. For you." For a moment it looked like she might refuse. Her pride was all she had left. But then, as if reality crashed into her all at once, she exhaled shakily, her fingers trembling as she slowly reached for the money. Ethan felt an unexpected relief wash over him. But he knew this wasn't enough. Not even close. Amelia's fingers barely brushed against the money before she stopped, her jaw tightening. Then, slowly, she withdrew her hand. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I can't take this." Ethan frowned. "Amelia, this isn't charity. I know what it is," she interrupted, her voice quieter now. "But money won't fix this. It won't change the fact that I work hard every day and still end up here. It won't change that my mother is sick and I can't afford the care she needs." She exhaled shakily, the exhaustion catching up to her. "It won't change that I asked for one meal and you said no." Ethan flinched. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even bitter. But her words hit harder than anything he had heard in years. She wasn't wrong. He had spent his entire career ensuring people didn't take advantage of him, enforcing rules, cutting costs, and keeping things strictly business. But tonight, he realized how blind he had been. This wasn't just about Amelia. How many other employees were barely holding on? How many had struggles he never bothered to see? His entire company had been built on efficiency, but in his pursuit of profit, he had overlooked the very people who kept his business running. Ethan exhaled, tucking the money back into his pocket. "Come with me," he said suddenly. Amelia's brows furrowed. "What? You and your mother? You're coming with me?" She hesitated. "Where?" "I have an empty apartment downtown," Ethan said. "It's yours until you can get back on your feet. No strings attached." Amelia's eyes widened. I can't accept that." "Yes, you can." Ethan's voice was firm, but not unkind. "Because I should have helped sooner. Because no one working a full-time job should have to live on the streets. And because I need to fix this. Not just for you, but for everyone I've ignored for too long." Amelia stared at him, uncertainty flickering in her expression. But when she looked down at her mother, still shivering despite the blankets, her decision was made. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. She wasn't the kind to cry, to beg, to ask for help. But tonight she would accept it. Not for herself, but for her mother. Ethan helped them into his car, turning the heat up as high as it would go. As he pulled away from the cold, unforgiving streets, he didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a man who had finally opened his eyes. Because this wasn't just about Amelia. This was about changing everything.